everyone. Juxtaposition here. I have a very special guest today. I think everybody knows who Mike Williams is, the sage of Quay. Today we're going to discuss the Beatles, which is the number one most popular musical band that's ever been. And supposedly, these numbers are not audited. These unaudited numbers are that the Beatles as a band sold over 1 billion records, of which 600 million of the billion was LP or long playing albums, and that the Beatles had over 21 or recorded 21 number one songs according to the musical accounting records, and that they had 34 songs in the top 10. And the Beatles live on today, 62 years. It's been John, Paul, George, and Ringo. The Beatles stand alone. They're important. They're huge in the baby boomers, but they live on into other generations, even in the Taylor Swift millennials, which is highly unusual for pop musical bands. Usually they just go one or two generations and then that's it, kind of like a one-hit wonder. Most people don't even make more than one-hit record. So at no further ado, I'm going to now present to you, to my loyal audience, Mike Williams, the sage of Quay. Mike?
Juxt, thank you so much for that intro. Yeah, so just a little background. My regular listeners have heard this before, but I was a huge Beatle fan. I was a Beatle freak. In fact, I had so much Beatle memorabilia that my brother used to come to my house and call it a Beatles shrine. I had Beatle pictures on the walls, and in my office, I had all kinds of Beatle this and Beatle that. And I wrote you an email the other day, and I had mentioned that I have a huge collection of Beatle records from all around the world. I was collecting Beatle vinyl for a very long time, and some of the vinyl that I have is extremely collectible. In fact, in the email, I explained that I have one of the rarest, if not the rarest, capital pressing of a Beatle album, Revolver, that exists. So they were huge in my life. And I was aware of the Beatles going back to, I would say, 1967, when I was 8 years old. By 1968, when Yellow Submarine came out, I was begging my mother and father to take me to the movie theater to go see Yellow Submarine. And my brother was right behind me, because my brother, who's also a musician, was only 14 months younger than I was. So between the two of us, we were so excited to go. And my father took us there, and I know he didn't have a good time, but Dad bit the bullet. And both my brother and I were disappointed because, you know, we were little and we didn't realize that Yellow Submarine was an animation. And it wasn't until the last, 5 or 10 minutes of the film where the Beatles came out, and that was very exciting for us. So the hour and a half of the animation was worth it just for the last 10 minutes of the film. I learned to play guitar by listening to Beatle music, and I started playing when I was about 14 or 15. I started before that, but I was really getting into it around 14 or 15. And the way I taught myself was to go by sheet music. And I taught myself the chord diagrams. And the sheet music that I bought was Beatle sheet music. And the reason for that was because when I played it, I knew whether I was playing it correctly or not. So if it sounded right, then I'm like, okay, well, I got that chord correct. As time went on, I continued to play guitar. I taught myself how to play keyboards, and I took some music theory when I was in my first year of college, going back into, I think that was 1978 or so. It's a long time ago. I was in and out of bands from the standpoint of writing original music. So, I mean, the personnel changed up a little bit, but the main players were me and my brother. And, we had a couple of other folks page in and out over time. We didn't play out because we were so focused on writing original music and then recording it and seeing if we can secure a recording contract, or at the very least a publishing contract.
You tell us, the audience, what instruments you played and your brother played, and how did you find a recording studio? And did that cost money, and how did that work?
Yeah. So I was a guitar player, and I also played bass, and I played some keyboards. My brother was the drummer, the initial drummer. He was also our primary bass player. So when he wasn't playing bass, or maybe he was playing keys or whatever, because my brother's a very good keyboard player as well, I would pick up the bass. So we swapped back and forth between my brother and I. I mean, he played a little bit of guitar. I did most of the guitar work. I did most of the songwriting, although my brother did write some songs as well. Later on, another drummer came into the band, and my brother became the primary bass player, and we had our drummer Max. My brother was the playing bass, and I was doing the guitar work, both rhythm and lead guitar playing. And then we had another friend of ours, Mark. He passed away a long time ago. He was a very good guitar player, and he's on a number of our demos going back 40 years ago. He died in a motorcycle crash. It's very unfortunate, and he was a very, very good guitar player. And so we had, like I said, we had different personnel in and out. My friend Jeff, who I went to high school with, and who I was very close friends with during our college days, he was also in the band, also a very good piano and keyboard player. So we had a number of people that could play. They were multi-instrumentalists. And usually the way it worked was like when Jeff was in the band, Jeff played keyboards. When at that point my brother was drumming and I was playing the guitar. And then when we brought in a different guitarist, we would swap between myself and Mark. That's how it works. It was like there was a dynamic that was going on. Initially,
how did you pick a recording or a studio to either rehearse or record?
Yeah, so in the late 1970s, another friend of ours, Phil, he wasn't in the band, but he liked the music that we were doing. He had a 2-track recorder. So initially what we were doing was we would record 2 tracks in my living room in my parents' house. As things evolved, we needed more than a 2-track recorder. So we ended up finding a studio out in Queens, New York. I believe the name of the studio, it doesn't exist anymore. It was Multisound. The guy that owned the studio, Dave, he was fantastic. He was a really good guy. We also recorded at another studio in Douglaston, Queens. And at that time, it was 16-track. And, we just thought, that was the top of the mountain to get to 16 tracks of recording. Remember, we started with 2. Then we went to 8, and then we went to 16. And the name of that studio was the Workshop Recording Studios in Douglaston, New York. And I don't believe they're in existence anymore either.
I got a question about the studios. How does the studio charge for the time that you use there? I mean, they don't care, I wouldn't think, if you finish your songs or not. They probably charge like by the hour or
by the hour.
Hours. And how much was that back in the 70s? And, because I would assume you have to really rehearse your material in the garage or in your living room so that when you're in the studio, that's high quality time. You're not learning the material when you're in the studio because it costs money, right?
Right. That's right.
So tell me a little bit about the economics of how you went about your recording activities when you were on the clock.
Yeah. So first of all, in 1977, 78, I was 18, 19 years old, and we didn't have a lot of money. The 16-track recording studio Workshop, now I'm going by memory, I believe back in the day that was $75 an hour. So we're talking about late 1970s.
What's a typical, how many hours do you need to do, recording of a song?
Well, like I said, we didn't have a lot of money, so we had to cobble together whatever we could. So we would go to the studio and we would try to get there with maybe $300 or $400, maybe $500 at $75 an hour. So we would book, 4 or 5 hours of time in the studio. That's what we would do. It's the same thing when we were doing 8 tracks at Multisound. I'm trying to remember what Dave charged back in the day, but maybe that was around, maybe $40 or $50 an hour. That's just, by the way, Tom, for the time. That didn't include, you had to buy the tape.
What's that cost?
The tape could cost you, depending upon the size of the reel, $50, $75 to $100.
So it does not include your end product.
No, it doesn't include the tape. So the tape you're going to record on, you have to buy. And it doesn't include any mastering. So if you decide that after you're done that you're going to master the record, that's a whole different process. Now, we never really got to the mastering process back in the day because we were young, and we got to the point where we would mix it really well, and we would go with what the final mix sounded like. Then what happened was, like this happens with a lot of bands. At some point, your music is not paying the bills. And so everybody has to go out and get a quarter reel job. And so, that's what we did. And when that happened, the band just kind of fell apart. And so what was left was me and my brother. And at the time, my brother lived in Maryland. At one point, I was in New Jersey, and then I moved to North Carolina. But I would make the trek to Maryland because downstairs in his house, he had a 4-track recording studio. My brother, he was a wizard. He still is with electronics. And he put together even though it was only 4 tracks, what he was able to do by bouncing tracks and all of the stuff that he was just very, very good at. He was like a wizard with this stuff. We walked out with some demos that rivaled what we were doing in 8-track and 16-track studios with a 4-track. So at that point, this was in the 90s. And so the late 70s, the 80s, we were doing 8-track, 16-track. And then when we got to the 1990s, and, the band had dispersed. Everybody went to go get a job. And I was doing songwriting and stuff like that as a hobby because, I had my job in the corporate world, and my brother also had his job. So that's how it worked. We had gotten to the point where initially when you do this stuff, you're trying to write and record songs that fit the pop music that is prevalent at the time, that's popular at the time.
Right.
Right.
What were some of the cover songs that you might record?
Oh, we never recorded cover. We played cover.
You only did original content.
We only did original. Yep. That's all.
Wow.
That's all we focused on. I explained in a couple of shows, and people asked me this question. Cover songs, although interesting, were in a way boring to me. They were already done. They were already recorded. I really didn't see the upside to reproducing them. They're already done. So I was always infatuated with writing original music.
There's a presumption that the music industry or the movie industry or the television industry, that they always go out and find the absolute most talented people and then sign them to contracts and record their music. And my personal experience, that's what I believed until I was about 21 years old, when my illusion was popped by the son of a Hollywood entertainment lawyer. And I was told that everything I believed, even though they didn't really know me that well, they said, whatever you believed the last 20 years, it's the inverse. They told me it was the reverse of what I thought. And I said, what do you mean? They said, yes, there are talented people who can play a variety of instruments and can sing, that have voices, that are on contract that you may hear on the radio. There are. And he said, and then there are the majority of people that you hear on the radio cannot play their instruments and cannot write music and cannot compose it and not select their wardrobe properly. And that's why we call it the entertainment industry, because it's a business.
Right.
It's a show business, and there are 2 elements to it. And people think that everything's organic and everybody does 100% on their own. But he said most musical bands are cover bands. They're cover bands. They've been playing other people's music at high school proms and at local small clubs, if they're lucky. And if they can get access to a venue, which most of them cannot get access to, West Hollywood venues like Whiskey A Go-Go, forget about it. You've got to have a contract or be in the process of getting a music contract to get on the stage of a presentation at the Whiskey A Go-Go or the Pandora Club or Rainbow Room or Starwood or the Troubadour. Those are really reserved for people that are being brought through the channel, that are either on contract or getting a contract. They're getting lined up to sign a deal. And so what I've learned is that there are talented people who can play music and write songs and compose melodies who do not have music contracts and are not in Hollywood or not part of the entertainment industry per se, and they're out there playing in saloons and things like that. And so this is the point that I'm making is that you're making is that you were not interested in recording cover songs.
We didn't see any reason to play covers. We didn't want to do the bar scene. We didn't want to do that stuff. We wanted to write original music. And we were under the false illusion, because it is an illusion, that if you write really good stuff and you produce it fairly well, that people are going to be interested. And you know what? That's really not true, because when we sent out demo tapes, I would get the demos back. I sent demos out to the major labels, to Capitol, to RCA, MCA, you name it. And they would come back with the envelopes unopened with a stamp on it that said, "We do not accept unsolicited material." So that was an education.
Wow.
Yeah, that's an education that I received very early on, which said that, hey, you know what? This is a closed shop. Unless you're connected in via management or some other connection, then the possibility that you're going to break into the industry organically or naturally, I'm not saying it can't be done, but the odds are stacked against you.
What you're describing there is Wall Street. And what these industries do is they put up walls and a perimeter. And unless you're groomed and selected, you cannot come onto their property and use their channels, their distribution channels,
right,
to get your music out. And so they do it in real estate too, right? Like if you want to sell your home and you put a for sale by owner sign, none of the commissioned realtors in your area will show your home. They won't. Even if they would get a commission from their buyer, they won't do it because it's going against what they call the MLS, the multiple listing service that they all believe in. It's a little cult, is that they all support full commission sales. So if there's somebody who's a stranger from outside the industry wants to sell their home, they just drive their clients a couple blocks around it so that the client doesn't say, "Hey, look, there's a home in the neighborhood, the exact neighborhood I want to live in that's for sale by owner." No, you don't want to look at that. Well, that you're describing original music that you've recorded already. You put it on a tape, you send the tape to RCA, and they don't even open it. They're not even interested in competitive music because it's not a competitive free market. It's not a free market. It's a pay-for-play, closed cabal.
And music is a formula. So whatever's popular at the time is what they're looking for. So if you are not writing music within that formula, give or take a certain bandwidth, then they're not going to listen to it because it's not what they deem to be popular.
How old were you when you had this moment of clarity? You put all that time and effort into recording, and then you get these packages coming back unopened saying that they won't discuss your music because it's unsolicited.
About 25, I would say, is when, because our first demo went out in 1982. We had a 6-song demo, and I was born in 59, so I was 23 at the time. My brother and I, what we're doing now is we're going back to a bunch of our old demos. We're redoing the songs or re-recording them with current day interpretations of them. We didn't want to do an exact replica of what we did back 40 years ago because some of the production techniques back in the day, there was a lot of reverb and stuff like that, which is not my cup of tea. It never was, but that's how things were produced back then. That's what led us to my brother's 4-track in Maryland, because we got sick and tired of being told, or implied, I should say, that you got to write this type of music, because if you don't write this type of music, then, not only are we not going to listen to you to begin with, but we're really not going to listen to you if you're not playing what's popular on the radio. They don't want to take risks. They really don't. It's an industry. It's a business. They're there to make money, plain and simple. So there's an entire network that's built into the music and entertainment industry that gives them a pipeline of what they need. And it's an illusion. It's a story. It's a fictional tale that there's talent coming from the outside. Now, that's not to say that talent isn't coming from the outside, but the talent that comes from the outside is, quote, discovered. It's discovered by some impresario, some producer, some A&R person. So basically what that means is you are being brought into the system, brought into the network. When you sign on the contract, there are contractual obligations. The terms and conditions say you've got to do X, Y, and Z. And, there's a whole piece of this that where the band is packaged. And not everybody in a band is in a secret society and all that stuff. People always ask me that. No, that's not the case. But the thing is, the record labels, they run the show, and they are run by secret societies. They are run by between themselves and organizations. We'll get into this in a little bit, like Tavistock and the CIA. This is all predetermined. And so if you don't play ball, if you're going to be difficult, then they'll just throw you out. I mean, it's as simple as that. You'll have a very short career. And I have a lot of people who are on my channel, subscribers, especially on my Beatles channel, who are songwriters and musicians, and they were signed by labels, and they got a record contract. And guess what? They didn't go anywhere, because after they were signed, the record label decided that they weren't going to invest in the band. And what a lot of people don't know is that when a band is signed to a contract and they go in to record an album, they get an advance from the label. That advance has got to be paid back.
Oh, it has to be refunded if what?
Let's say my band went in and we got signed by, I don't know, just Capitol back in the day. And we're going in to record an album. Well, Capitol would say, look, we really like your stuff, Mike, and the band. And so we're going to invest in you. And so we're going to advance you this much money to record the album. But that advance is recouped through the sales of the album, through any type of touring performances that you're doing. So the record company is really never out money.
So they're not giving you an advance.
They're not really investing in you when you come to
they're
think.
psyching. It's a psych out.
I mean, they are investing, but the thing is, they're getting their investment back. So they're going to invest $1. They're going to get at least $1 back. And, and if you're really successful, then they're going to make a lot more money than a dollar for dollar transaction. So what happened was we just got, my brother and I just gave up on the whole record signing bit and publishing. We decided that we were just going to record our music for our own happiness. And that's what we did during the 1990s in his 4-track studio. And we did a lot of, I thought, really good music, fun music. I would have 3 days, right? I would take a long weekend from work. And when I'd say to my brother, look, I've written a couple of songs. We're probably only going to be able to get one down. So I'm going to come down. So I would scoot down there on a Friday. I would leave early in the morning, and he would have everything set up. And, we would just chat a little bit, and then we would get right down to business. And he would say, okay, so what's the song, Mike? So I played on the guitar or whatever, or the piano. And he's like, okay, got it. And then the two of us would just put the songs together. And by, Sunday afternoon, when I was ready to go home, we had a completed song, a demo. And that's what we were doing. And it was just fun. So it got to the point where initially it was, we want to get a record contract, or we want a publishing contract, to forget about all that. We just want to have fun. We just want to record music and be creative. And that's where I'm at today too with my music.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that a little bit of the deception about a record label offering an advance to a promising group, but only if they're confident that they're going to get that 100% of that advance back plus additional. Otherwise, I guess they wouldn't offer the advance. But I'm come from a finance auditing background, and of course my bubble got popped by someone who was a CPA like me, whose father was an entertainment lawyer in Beverly Hills Century City office, which is where his office was also the big international accounting firm, which happened to have an office in the Century Towers. And I used to visit there because I turned in my expenses. I had a San Francisco office, but I was down in business in Los Angeles a lot, and I would go over there because Beverly Hills was a nice place to go to dinner. And so I would meet him, and he would tour me around the area. That's how I got acquainted to it. But we talked about these accounting things, because most of the artists don't understand how they get paid. It's rather complicated. But even if you did understand how they're going to pay your advance and how they're going to pay you through record sales, I'm here to tell you that Doris Day, who was a Columbia Records artist, Judy Garland, who's Capitol Records EMI, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, which is Capitol Records EMI, the Beatles, which is EMI, Sharon Tate, who is not a recording artist, but had a contract with MGM and CBS Television, which is part of Columbia. Those five, four of which are musical artists: Doris Day, Judy Garland, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, the Beatles, and Sharon Tate. They all had Jewish A&R reps.
Yes.
100%. They were Jewish. All the studios that they signed with were executive vice president, executive directors, board directors, all Jewish, 100%. They all had claims of embezzlement of their contract. In the case of Doris Day, she went to court. It took 4 years. She won a $22 million judgment against Jerome Rosenthal. He lost, but his insurance company ended up, settling for about 40 cents on the dollar on that. Doris did not get $23 million, but she did win the court. It was in the LA Times. Sharon Tate did not sue Martin Razshoff because before she renewed her 7-year contract, she got bayoneted 7 times and died. No, she got bayoneted 16 times. Judy Garland, she got ripped off from 2 Jewish A&R reps. They stole 100% of Judy Garland's money when she was living next to Puff Daddy. She was 100% ripped off by those 2 Jewish her agents, and they left her with a $500,000 bill to the IRS. Not only she had no money, that's why she went out to do all that touring in her 40s, was because she was flat broke. That's why Doris Day did the Doris Day television show on CBS, because she was completely broke. And Brian Wilson, he had Eugene Landy, who I believe is Jewish. He's a PhD psychologist, and he fleeced Brian Wilson for unknown amounts of money, in the millions. And the Beatles, they got Alan Klein, who replaced Leopold Epstein, who everybody thinks is Linda Easton's father, because Linda Eastman is Linda Epstein.
Right.
And she is the daughter of Leopold Epstein, and that's who managed Paul McCartney, or right. Paul McCartney's replacement was Leopold Epstein and his son, John. And then their daughter, or the sister, Linda, she married Paul McCartney. They managed all their money. They have power of attorney over the Paul McCartney. If you have power of attorney over someone, you can steal all their money.
Yeah.
You can take their money. You have the checkbook.
You can transact as them. Yes.
So the Beatles had Alan Klein, which was a Yoko Ono idea. And he ripped off the Rolling Stones, and he ripped off the Beatles. And Paul McCartney had Leopold Epstein, and Brian Wilson had Eugene Landy, a psychologist, who also handled, the Brady Bunch, and he handled Alice Cooper. Eugene Landy was the psychologist for Alice Cooper, and Brian Wilson's psychologist was Eugene Landy. And Marcia Brady, Maureen McCormick, she had to go see Eugene Landy. And so anyway, this story about how you get paid is exacerbated by the fact that the record companies are deciding, the mathematics of how you get your royalty. And then they put a Jewish A&R rep on you and a psychologist on you. And if they get their numbers wrong, they just steal your money. So you might be getting nothing.
Yeah, well, the Beatles, the Beatles got ripped off too. The head of EMI, Parlophone at the time of the Beatles, when they were there, was Joseph Lockwood. He was Jewish. Of course, Brian Epstein was Jewish. And if you go back and take a look at the percentages that Brian Epstein was taking to manage the Beatles, he was soaking them. And also when it got to publishing, it was the same thing. When he formed Northern Songs, and then, of course, then it went to ATV Sony. And by the time it got to Sony, by 1969, I think that the Beatles were pretty much at zilch as far as what they were collecting from publishing.
Yeah, so, you're talking about indentured servants, essentially, whereas the presentation is they're enormously financially successful. If you look at the Wikipedia pages for Michael Jackson or Puff Daddy,
right,
or Madonna or J-Lo, Jennifer Lopez, or God help you, Taylor Swift, Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, they'll tell you that they are producers, songwriters, influencers, publishers. In reality, they're just indentured servants. They don't even own their houses.
They're commodities.
So let me ask you this. So what is the story on the Beatles? What age were you that you started to really look under the rocks and say, hey, I already know that the music industry is not as advertised. It's looks like it's a closed group. And when did you apply your realization that the music industry is different than presented? When did you take that magnifying glass and apply it to the Beatles?
Much later on. So I was in love with the Beatles. The Beatles were the reason why, like I said, I played the guitar. I wanted to write music. I wanted to record. They were unbelievably influential for me, as they are with many musicians and songwriters. Yeah. I had gotten into conspiracy and truth research, I guess around, 2010, 2011. I started my blog back in 2011. And at that point, I was taking a look into a lot of areas, but I still didn't look at the music industry. And I knew about the Paul is dead rumor, but I was like so many other people. I just said, it's just nonsense. And the Beatles did it as a way to drive more record sales because the Beatles are clever and witty, because that's the whole story. The geniuses. That's what's built around them. They were just these clever, witty guys. And this was another one of those things that they were doing with their fan base and so on. And, and I bought that. I was drinking the Kool-Aid.
Sure.
But what happened was
it's delicious Kool-Aid. It's really flavorful.
Well, that's the thing, Juxt, right? I always say this to people. Who does not like the Beatles' official story? I call it the Cinderella story. Who doesn't like? It's a great story.
No, it's a great story.
It's a great story. These four guys from Liverpool, they hook up with a record store owner, Brian Epstein, and from there they wind up with a contract with EMI, one of the largest, if not the largest record label at the time. And then from there, unprecedented fame and fortune. It's a Cinderella story, right? So,
yes.
And we're told that John Lennon and Paul McCartney were brilliant, genius, prolific songwriters. And, you bought this.
Right.
So, because, you would listen to the records and they're singing and you would think to yourself, well, who else is doing that?
I wish
right?
I could do that.
Who else could it be? So what happened was in 2016, I stumbled upon this book. It's the memoirs of Billy Shears, folks. At the time, it was a red-covered book, and I read that in 2016, and the book had come out in 2009. So I bought the book, and I started reading it, and as I was reading it, I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was revealing all of this information. It's so diametrically opposed to the official narrative. So what I decided to do was to do the research to either A, debunk or disprove what the book was saying, or to find out if what the book was saying was truthful. And to make a long story short, the more I dug in, the more I found out that the book was telling the truth. So what would happen is I would go do the research, and then you would find pieces of information, mainstream information. That's the most important thing. This is mainstream information because they hide the truth in plain sight.
View.
So I started going through it, and the thing with the book is it's encoded. It's a Masonic book. It's written from a Masonic point of view. So Tom Harriet, who is the encoder, he's the ghostwriter, but he's referred to as the encoder because the book is encoded. This book not only helped me to get over the hurdle with the whole Beatle conspiracy, but this book taught me so much about how Masonry communicates. And the book is layered, and it's encoded on various levels. So the first layer is you just read the book like you would read any other book. It's just the words, right?
Right.
And you just take it at face value. There's a second layer of encoding where on each page, there are bolded out words. And when you read the bolded out words, now you have another layer that reveals more information. And then there's a layer called the acrostical code. The acrostical code reads vertically. So every other letter at the beginning of each sentence on a page, when you put those letters together, they form sentences. And now you get more information. The other piece of this book is it actually invites you to go outside the book, which is what I did, to investigate whether the claims in the book are true or not. And then there's been a fifth layer that was introduced by Tom called the whisper messages. Now, the whisper messages are in the current version of the book. I think the most current version is May of 2023, so about a year ago. and it's very faint text that's printed on many of the pages. And when you read it, it's giving you more information. And plus, back in 2018, Tom added footnotes. Way back when in 2016, I wanted to have him on my show to do an interview. Initially, he said yes, but then after about a week, he said he couldn't do it. He couldn't do any shows. And I'm pretty sure I know what happened.
Somebody, you think maybe he talked to someone?
Yeah, I think Tom went in to check to see if he could do some interviews. Okay, yeah. To plug the book, and legal counsel said not a good idea because you've signed an NDA. The possibility that you can breach the NDA, even innocently, could create a problem for you. So you know what? Don't do it. But over time, what's happened is Tom Harriet and I have a mutual respect for each other. So I did my thing and Tom does his thing. And periodically, we would communicate. I would ask him questions about certain parts of the book and to ask him, are you or is the book going in this direction? I would ask him, if he could help me. Guidance. He could help me directionally. Am I on the right path with this thing?
In other words, it's ambiguous, but you're just looking for a directional.
Right.
Are you on the right path?
On the right path. And where Tom was able to do that, he did. And he's always been extremely professional. He's a good guy.
The book is called The Memoirs of Billy Shears.
Yes.
Is that what it's called?
Yes, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. Yeah.
Okay. So what you described with the 5 different layers of messaging, just reading it
plus
straight
the footnotes,
up like it was a fictional book, and then there's the second and third and fourth levels, including the footnotes at the latest version. What crossed my mind when you were explaining that was that's the last words spoken by Erin Valente, age 33. The last word she ever spoke after she met with a Jewish banker at 2500 Sandhill Road, Menlo Park, across the street from Stanford University. The last word she spoke to her mother, who was in Rochester, New York, when she heard these words. It's all a game. It's a thought experiment. We're in the matrix. And then the phone clicked off, and 5 days went by where nobody knew where Erin Valente was. Then she turned up in front of a 999 Masonic address on Bowes Lane, 7 houses south of Diablo Way. Diablo, the devil way, and Bowes Lane. Count 7 houses down. The house with the only house on the block that has solar panels on it is her rent-a-car with her dead in the back seat. And no cause of death for 4 months until the coronavirus broke out. And then the medical examiner called Erin Valente's death at age 33 a manic episode. She had a manic episode. It's like saying I had a sore throat. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about, right? It's all a game. It's a thought experiment. We're in the matrix. Well, that's the Memoirs of Billy Shear. That's like a documentary blueprint of what the last words of Erin Valente to her mother in Rochester, New York. It's almost the same thing. One's in a book form and one's in a cell phone call.
I would recommend anybody who's interested in the Beatles conspiracy to read this book. This book represents exactly the way our world operates. Signs and symbols rule the world.
Right.
Not words.
Laws, not words.
Exactly. So when you get to this book, you're going to have to spend some time to understand the signs and symbols.
It's not the Beatles per se. It's using the Beatles as a metaphor, as they were used in popular culture to deliver woke messages to us.
Right.
They delivered many Masonic messages. The Beatles aren't the whole world, okay? You don't have to be a Beatles fan to understand that it's a metaphor. And if you look at how the Beatles were managed, presented, promoted, what songs they sang, what messages you could decode, it's in everything. I mean, just look around. The Capitol Records building, EMI in West Hollywood, is at 1770 Vine Street. That's a 15. That's a triple nickel. It has 13. It's like a stack of disc records. The Capitol Records building is a stack of records, 13 stories. And it's at a triple nickel address, just like the Bank of America World Headquarters, just like the Merchants Exchange building, which on the 13th floor is home to the Knights of Malta, which is a fraternal brother of the Knights of Templar in Switzerland. So there are Masonic messages if you understand the street addresses, the numerology, and then more importantly, not only do you recognize the number sequences, and you know the gematria. What is the meaning that is related to those numbers?
The thing is, what I explain to my audience, Juxt, all the time is the world is run by occultists, period. If you're thinking that it's run by politicians and political parties and prime ministers and presidents and the House of Representatives here in the U.S. or senators or the parliament in the U.K., you're wrong. They are agents of the cultic elite. They're running the entire world. People ask me, what about the president of the United States? Where is he? I said, if I had to put him in a corporate structure, he's middle management somewhere.
You say middle. Okay.
Middle management is, it's okay, but it's not the top of the
comfortable living.
It's not the top of the mountain,
Yeah.
So, and this is what people have to understand. And, many folks don't want to understand that because it makes them extremely uncomfortable because like I mentioned before we started the show, everybody wants their world in a box with a bow on it. And they want to say, I've got everything understood and I have everything in my box that I need to know. And anything that's not in my box, I don't need to know. So when you
put blinders on,
it's very myopic. And so when you come along or I come along or many others who are doing different research in different areas, and we say, you know what, you're missing stuff in your box. They blow a fuse. They become emotionally triggered. They start to lash out. You see this all the time. I see this all the time. I've become just immune to it a long time ago because when you do this work, you come to the realization very quickly that you're in a minority, a really small minority, okay? And there's a lot of people out there, the vast majority of people have no idea what you're talking about. And if you say something that cuts across their grain, they become very agitated. They can become belligerent and nasty. And I was saying before about the Beatles conspiracy or the Paul is dead community. Many of them just want to talk about the replacement of biological Paul McCartney, and they want to focus on Billy, who replaced him. He's the primary replacement. What they don't understand is that there would be no replacement if the first part of the equation didn't do their job. A lot of them want to embrace that Cinderella story. They want to believe the Beatles were organic and the Beatles were natural and they were extremely talented. They were brilliant songwriters. They were geniuses. All of this stuff. They were magical, so on and so on and so forth. And like I said, I get it because I was there at one time. My research, what happened with me was, okay, I focused on the replacement of Paul. Fine. Yes, he was replaced. To me, it's extremely obvious. But then I started to think, things just didn't pop up when he was replaced. There's something going on here. At this point, I completely understood that the music and entertainment industry was completely controlled. So I said, no. We have to look at the whole thing. We have to look at the whole Beatles story, not a subset of it, the whole story. Some of these psychological operations, like the Beatles, are fundamental and foundational to everything that follows, right? It's the building blocks of other genres of music, as an example. This is why we have so many bands that followed in different genres. And they pay homage to the Beatles. They will say, the Beatles were so influential. They were an inspiration, or Paul McCartney was inspirational to me. And it takes time to understand it because at first it sets you back because everything that you think you knew about how the world really works unravels. It's very uncomfortable for people to be faced with that situation. You mean I've been lied to about that my whole life? Not only that, but a whole bunch of other stuff too. And so that's what happens. A lot of people will write me and say, Mike, I'm really grateful for the work that you've done on the Beatles because it is this conspiracy that opened my eyes to look at other things.
Right.
So that's why it's good that there's a lot of research out there like yourself and others who are focusing on different conspiracy topics.
If you take the music industry as a metaphor or the Beatles as a metaphor within music, then you could apply it to banking, investments, Wall Street.
And what the audience needs to understand is that the way this world works, they're constantly playing three-card Monte with everybody. It's not as it appears. Everything is an illusion. And I told Ole Damagard going back a number of years ago, we were having a talk. He was a guest on my show. Mm-hmm. And I said, anything worth knowing is a lie. And people ask me, like, well, what does that mean? It means that if information or knowing something would help you in your life, that it's truthful and you would benefit from it, then they're
Yes.
going to lie to you because they don't want you to benefit. They don't want you to be smart. And by the way, everybody should have learned a lesson with the March 2020 event. Ask yourself. So when people get all upset with me talking about the Beatles, or they get upset with you talking about the deep state, take a step back and ask yourself, how was it in March of 2020, was the whole world coordinated to communicate out the exact same message, the same script, the same process? So when people come to us and say, oh, somebody would have said something, somebody would have outed them. Look, you have to understand
centralized control.
Centralized control. And anybody who does say something will be marginalized and beaten down in a nanosecond. So ask yourself that. That was a hoax.
Before that, we already had 5G rollout was underway. I believe technically 5G, it really rolled out, I think, in 2015, but officially they say it was 2018 that it really came online. I think that's a lie. I think it was online before that. But it doesn't matter because 4G is dangerous also, and 3G is dangerous also, and cell phones work, with much less frequency. Your cell phone worked. So this is not about cell phone coverage. It's about weaponizing. And if you already have what Timothy Leary did to Ted Kaczynski at Harvard University, they did electroshock treatments on Ted Kaczynski, and now you're doing it to every person in every neighborhood. And you say, oh my God, we have a flu symptom called the coronavirus, and we're all going to die. And it doesn't matter if you're in the South Pole or the North Pole, or if you're in Guatemala or Costa Rica or Paris, France, or Milan, Italy. The virus has gone 100% around the whole planet, everywhere, in every city. It doesn't make any difference. It's in every zip code from China to Paris. So we have to have one policy. We need one vaccine. We need one mandate overnight. Push a button. And how could that happen in real life if there was sovereignty and independent thinking and thought processes and discussion and debate? The idea of follow the science is an oxymoron. If you follow the science, you're going to do a lot of research because there are different opinions on how to handle every situation. So there isn't one way to do things. And that's science. So if you think science is one program, you've lost your mind. In other words, you're not following the science. You're following a cult. You wear a face diaper. That's obedience ritual. You don't challenge the narrative. That's an obedience ritual.
While we're on it, I may as well get into this a little bit. So, folks, it's so important that when you want to really understand how the world really works, you have to read books. And there's a lot of people that have done extensive research, many people who have looked into organizations. Probably one of the most important ones as far as propaganda goes is Tavistock. Okay, it's worldwide. Here's a book I recommend. So this is from Daniel Esterlin, and it's Tavistock Institute, Social Engineering the Masses. And I think Daniel's book was published in 2008. Okay, very good book. It's a very good primer. Another book, which is really excellent, is the book by Dr. John Coleman. This was published in 2005. This is only 20 years ago. It's the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, Shaping the Moral, Spiritual, Cultural, Political, and Economic Decline of the United States of America.
Is that, would you call that an alchemy? When you change a society to a different type of society?
Yeah, it's alchemical. Yeah, it's out with the old, in with the new. Daniel's book is excellent. I like Dr. Coleman's book a lot because his chapters are maybe 4 or 5, maybe 6 pages in length, but he covers, he breaks it down into many different chapters. So he's got 35 chapters in this book, and it's very succinct. The information and the dots that he connects is amazing. And again, it's only 20 years ago, but when you think about it, you think, well, Dr. Coleman wrote this book in 2005, 20 years ago, and they were doing what they were doing back then and before then. Where are they now?
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of people can't get their heads wrapped around there is a one world government that's already in place. It's already there, and it has been there for a long time.
Long time.
It has taken them time to dot all their I's and cross all their T's, to get all their ducks in order. But
and technology has, evolved
technology
to where they can do things now they couldn't do, let's say, 25 years
exactly
or 50 years ago. They couldn't do this when John Kennedy was president.
Yes.
They probably would have had they had the tools. And they have some new tools in the toolbox.
Tavistock, just so people know, is the hub. It's the headquarters of social engineering and propaganda for the world.
It's like they definitely have, a horizontal, interwoven fabric
Yes.
with a hierarchy of authority, militarized, like a corporation, like NATO.
Yep.
A military divisions, departments, rank.
NATO comes in under Tavistock. Club of Rome comes in under Tavistock.
There you go.
MIT comes in under Tavistock, and Tavistock is connected at the hip with the Rockefeller Foundation and the CIA.
Super.
People have to come to grips with the fact that these are all interconnected. It's like you said, Juxt. It's a horizontal. Okay. They're all interconnected. It's all interlaced. So they're all working with each other. There's a federation of secret societies. We can say the umbrella group is the Masonic order. Okay. But there are many, many secret societies.
Right.
And if you're a Mason, you might also belong to another secret society, or you probably
like
do.
Knights of Malta, for example.
Or the Pilgrim Society. We can go on and on. What I'll call, for lack of a better term, the elites are able to do in these secret societies is they can set aside their differences. It's not like they don't have differences. But what happens is they come together for a common goal. They could say,
for mutual benefit.
Mutual benefit of control. Okay. They're looking for total control. A one world government, a one world religion. That's the new world order. So they can set aside their differences and say, this is what they sit at the table and they say, look, I don't agree with you, but you know what? We'll deal with that after we have the whole thing locked down. Once we have that, then we'll sit down and we'll iron out the details about what it is that you think and what it is that I think, or what I want or what you want, and we'll divide up the pie. But we can't divide the pie up until we control the pie. So that's where they're at with this thing. And so Tavistock got its start in the military, British military, going back to World War I, Wellington House, which was the Ministry of Propaganda, if you will.
And then they set up World War I.
Yes, they did. They set up World War I. They were behind it. And the reason why is because they felt the Germans were going to be too much of a powerful force, and they couldn't have it. They had to go to war. The problem that the British had was the British people wanted nothing to do with war with the Germans because they didn't see the Germans as an enemy. So back in the day, the British people were saying, what are you talking about? Why are we going to war with Germany? We don't want to.
So you have to socially manufacture consent somehow?
So, right, exactly. So Tavistock manufactured consent. They own, really, when I say own, I mean they really do control all of the media. As they got further along, the technology piece of this thing, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote all about the technocratic society. But in any case, my point being is, so it goes back to, World War I. The precursor was Wellington House. That became Tavistock. And Tavistock's premise at the time was that, hey, a lot of soldiers were shell shocked from the war. So we have to understand them psychologically. What you had a base of people that had psychological issues. So now you have your premise.
You have research guinea pigs.
Yes, you have research guinea pigs. So it just continues on from there. They were very much behind World War II as well. Have always had their sights on the United States, because the United States was the biggest hurdle to a one world everything, because the United States was free. The United States had its sovereignty. The United States had its sense of nationalism. And so going back.
That's gone now.
It's gone. I agree with you. It's gone. But I'm saying back when it was Wellington House and back in the early days of World War I leading into World War II, they had to change all this stuff, and they introduced.
And are you suggesting that the Beatles may have been one of the weapon systems?
Of course, yeah. The Beatles were. I mean, music in general, but the Beatles, they were a massive Tavistock psychological operation. with the intent to social engineer the world, the United States included, obviously. In fact, when the Beatles came to the U.S. in February of 1964, when they landed here, it was referred to as the Beatles conquering America.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't say the Beatles arrived in America. It's the Beatles conquering America. So, back in the day, the United States was rooted in traditional values and institutionalized religions, in particular Christianity. Tavistock has an utter hatred for Christianity because it's in the way of where they want to go. They have been at war with the Christian faith going back to 1962. In memoirs, it tells us that the Illuminati, call them whatever you want, the Committee of 300, the Illuminati, the controllers, declared war on Christianity on September 11th of 1962. And September 11th is a very important date in the occult because 9/11 is what is referred to in the occult circles as a day of war. It could be physical war or it can be psychological war. And this is why many key events take place on 9/11.
This 9/11 comes up. I'm not even looking for it. I'm just stumbling across it. It's everywhere.
Yes.
9/11 or 20, double X.
I tell people it's either the date or it's encoded. So as an example, if we go back to COVID-19 and coronavirus, COVID-19 has Pythagorean numerology of 9. It reduces to 9. Coronavirus in Pythagorean numerology, that's their favorite numerology, Pythagorean numerology, reduces to 11. So COVID-19 coronavirus was a 9/11 event.
Oh, interesting. And then 9 could be the letter A and I. I is the 9th letter of the alphabet. That could be artificial intelligence.
Yes, AI is 19. Yes. And if we go back to Black Lives Matter, it was referred to as Black Lives Matter, or BLM was the acronym. BLM has Pythagorean numerology of 9, and you spell it out, Black Lives Matter, it's 11. So that was a 9/11 event as well. Later in the year, there was the presidential, quote, presidential debate between Trump and Joe Biden. That took place on September 29th. 2 plus 9 is 11. So that was encoded 9/11 as well. Now, the EMI building, EMI, the acronym, reduces to the number 9. 9 is important to the occultists because the number 9 represents endings. Something is ending. Something has been transformed. Something has been changed. So when they throw the number,
what the address was for Ben Siegel, Bugsy Siegel, where he had his head shot. He was shot 9 times. Ben Siegel was shot through the living room window 9 times with that military M1 carbine semi-automatic rifle. 4 times in his head, 5 times his body. 9 bullets.
Right.
So he's shot 9 times in a number 9 mansion on North Linden Drive.
Yeah, that means that was the end.
and it was.
It was, right.
That was it. No more Ben Siegel. So anyway, what I'm telling you is this number 9 business, it's everywhere.
Yes, it is. It's everywhere. The number 10 also. 10 is beginnings.
You think Billy was introduced in 1966 as opposed to the Sgt. Pepper's album? You think Billy was?
I believe Billy was around the whole Beatle operation early on. I had a researcher come on, Stacy. She did a brilliant piece of work. So I was mentioning the book before, right? So I tell people the book, it's like a puzzle. It's a big puzzle to solve. So in the book, it alludes to the possibility that Billy Shear's father might be Aleister Crowley. The thing is, though, Stacy came on and she said, I don't think so. Based upon other clues in the book, she believes that Billy's family tree, his lineage, his ancestry goes back to the Douglas Hamiltons. So his father would have been Douglas Hamilton, who is a lord. He was a lord. He passed away. I think he passed away in the 1970s. And his mother was on the Percy bloodline. So the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys are blue bloods. So if Stacy is correct, and she puts forth a very compelling case, and I think she could very well be correct, then Billy comes from this bloodline. And if we listen to the line in the song, A Day in the Life, it says nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords.
Oh boy. There you go.
So I believe it's very possible that that is Billy's family tree, the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys. And by the way, on the Percy side, his mother's side, there is Campbell bloodline. I believe he goes back to at least 1962 with the Beatles. So from the very beginning, he's formally trained as a musician. He's a multi-instrumentalist. In the book, he tells us that he was a session player. Aside from the fact that he was able to play multiple instruments, he was also very good at mimicking vocals. So he would be hired to come in to sound like a singer that maybe everybody knew. Maybe that singer couldn't make it that day. They were sick or whatever. They would call Billy in and he would do the vocals, right? So that kind of lends some understanding to people will say, well, how does he sound so much like Paul McCartney? Well, because he's very good at vocal mimicry. So that was one of his, his skills. And he's also he's a wind and piano player by trade. He knows how to play the wind instruments, the trumpet, the tuba.
He's very versatile.
He's very versatile, yes. And he's obviously a very good piano player. That's the other thing people need to really think about. Before 1966.
Yeah, Paul wasn't playing the piano.
George Martin did all the piano playing on those records between 62 and 66. And some people will argue, well, Paul McCartney had a piano in his bedroom
at the Ashers.
At the Ashers. Well, that doesn't mean he played the piano. I mean, he wasn't a piano player.
Margaret Asher was a music teacher.
Yes, she was George Martin's music teacher.
Have pianos.
Exactly.
Yeah. And she taught George Martin. He was a student of hers.
Right. That's
Margaret Asher taught the oboe
to George
Martin.
Brian Epstein didn't even have any background in talent of artists or anything like that. His family owned a furniture store.
Right, furniture.
And then they got into records, and then it became a large record store, NEMS. And his parents had him manage the store. That's how he got his job. When you go back and you look at it, it was a big setup. It was really just.
I got a lot of intel on Brian Epstein. He was also a homosexual.
Yes.
He was controlled. The Royal Army had him seeing psychologists.
Yes, that's right.
Or he would go to the stockade. So what do you want to do? See a psychologist or be in prison? He supposedly, impersonated an officer in Piccadilly Circus at a bar or something. So whatever. It doesn't really matter if that's a true story or not. They sent Brian Epstein to the Royal Academy for Dramatic Art. And he was there with Burt Reynolds' future wife, the Socket Toomey girl. Any time in history, if you go to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, there's going to be someone in there that's going to be, selected for film or television. So anytime, so when Brian Epstein was sent there, which would have been like 1959 or 1960 or something like that, there would be Peter Niven or, these women that became motion picture stars or got a job at Laugh-In, for example, as the Socket Toomey lady who then married Burt Reynolds. And there's all kinds of every single person that's in the Brian Epstein story. It's 2 degrees of separation from someone got killed in Hollywood. And it turns out that Brian Epstein got killed in Sussex. Suicide. They're always suicides. That's the default setting.
All of this stuff, these people, these events, like we mentioned earlier, Juxt, they're all connected. And people might be asking, well, how are all of these people connected? And they're connected through the brotherhood, through the secret societies. And what I've explained to my audience is there's a pyramid of power. It's a corporate structure. Just like a corporation, they have people, they have skills and resources, and some people specialize in this and others specialize in that. So whenever something has to get done, psychological operation, some kind of project, some kind of initiative, they pull together their best resources within that Masonic corporation to go work on these projects. And so they're in that pyramid and we are outside the pyramid. And in order to protect their whole process and who they are and how they operate, it's got to be done in secrecy. So you're fed all kinds of official narratives, stories. These are fictional accounts of how things work and how things go down. And
Right.
so that's put out there through the media, and you're
Right.
deluged with all of this nonsense. And
Right.
you're told that the world works this way when the world doesn't work that way at all. You're spoon-fed nonsense from the media, from your television set, from magazines and newspapers, the radio, the internet. It's all nonsense. That's how it works. So they pull from within. As an example, when Billy wanted to write this book, how did that work? Well, Tom's a Freemason. I asked him, I said, well, how did you learn this encoding? It's extremely elaborate. He said when he was younger, he said that he was taught how
They
to
give
do
him
this.
games or something, puzzle.
He was educated on how to do encoding. Now, what that process was, I don't know. He didn't go into that much detail with me. And he said to me, Mike, at the time, I had no idea why I was learning this, why I was being taught this. So that's the other thing. They plan and plot
Decades
in advance. Decades in advance. If you go back and you read this book, you read the book by John Coleman Tavistock, and you read about what they were talking about back at the turn of the century, 1900s, and in the 1930s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and you see what's happened today, like you said, Juxt, it's way in advance.
It's a plan.
It's a plan. It's a long-term plan. And how are they able to do that? Because they are in that pyramid. And that pyramid is comprised of a federation of secret societies that all work together with a common goal of control. So as a person passes away, because they do die, right? They have plenty of backfill, to use a corporate term, to be replaced. People who have been trained and educated on how to do these things. Maurice Strong, who was with the Club of Rome. I mean, he was from the Tavistock organization, the Tavistock Institute. Now, Maurice Strong passed away, but he was integral. He was very, very important in formulating the whole green agenda, basically blaming humans for everything that goes wrong on Earth. That was Maurice Strong's, that was his bailiwick and his area of expertise that he was expected to pull off. And quite frankly, he did a good job because it's everywhere. But going back to Billy for a second, I just want to people are probably wondering, you started on Billy and you didn't finish. So I believe Billy was in the equation since 1962.
Right.
The book tells us that he was doing session work at EMI and EMI Studios. And going back a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, there was an article that came out and he said, I wrote the music to the song In My Life. And he's saying this as Paul McCartney. This stirred up a big pot. And so the media had to go into damage control because that was a John Lennon song.
Right.
100% John Lennon. So what's going on?
We're going against the narrative here.
Going against the narrative. So what Billy was doing was, for those that are in the know and know that he's not Paul McCartney, he's dropping a clue. He's saying, I was there before 1966 because In My Life was recorded in 1965. And the last time I checked, 1965 came before 1966. Wink, wink. He was stirring the pot because the media went into damage control. And what they did was, this is the story we get, right? And of course, all of the profane will just fall in line and believe this. It's so ridiculous. There was 2 universities. I forgot the name of them because it goes back 3 or 4 years ago.
Right.
They ran computer models, Juxt, because everything is about, if it goes through a computer, it's got to be true, right?
It's got to be correct. Absolutely.
It's got to be correct. And the computer models kicked out and said, nope, he was wrong. He misremembered.
That's what lawyers say.
That's
lawyers
a John Lennon song.
When you don't answer the question the way they told you to answer, they say you misremembered. As far as correct things coming out of the computer, I seem to remember seeing a Hollywood film called 2001 Space Odyssey.
Yes.
We had a problem where the astronauts had to go outside the mothership to retrieve a deceased astronaut, then returned. Hal, open the pod bay doors, Hal. Hal, do you read me? I'm sorry, Dave. This conversation serves no purpose.
Hal is IBM. What they did was they just backed up one letter. That's all they did.
Of course.
Isn't that funny? So anyway, the thing with Billy is he's got the primary contract, the primary role as the replacement for Paul. The question is, what happened to Paul?
But
Yeah.
what date do you think that was
So the
approximately?
book tells us September 11th, 1966 is when Paul died.
You're not so sure?
Paul was swapped out in 1966. He was replaced in
Yeah, well, that's
1966.
what I think what I was suggesting earlier. Now, there's people that say, but what about Jane Asher and what about, Paul McCartney, biological Paul McCartney's brother? He has a brother and he has a father, James, right? And I always tell people, well, time out. You do realize that it's everybody in the circle is in the group.
Juxt,
So
it's a small
you
club
can
and we're not
switch
in it.
anybody out.
But people really, really have to come to grips with. See, what they're doing is they're applying I don't like saying this, folks. They apply their profane reasoning and logic to an initiated group of people who are in that pyramid. So when
It
we
doesn't
talk,
apply.
it doesn't apply. So you're thinking, oh, wouldn't Jane Asher say something? No, Jane Asher is part of the club
She's
for
part
goodness
of the
sake.
psychops.
So his brother, Mike McCartney or Mike McGee, or some people question whether that's really Paul's
Yeah,
biological. Who knows? But it doesn't matter whether it is or it isn't. He's in on the operation. People will say to me, well, if Paul died, wouldn't it be a death certificate? It's a deep state operation. What is
So
it you
no,
don't get
there
about
wouldn't
this?
be. Look, I just gave you an example of George Harrison. He died on Laurel Canyon,
Right.
but the address is Coldwater Canyon. Those are two different canyons. You don't have to live in Los Angeles to understand. There it goes Laurel Canyon, then it's Franklin Canyon, Coldwater Canyon. There's no mistaking Laurel Canyon for Coldwater Canyon. They're not the same. And the addresses are not the same. One is on the south side of the Santa Monica Mountain Range, where the death certificate reads. But then we're told that he died on the north side near William Shatner's house. He's like 1 mile from where Noreen Shatner, the third ex-wife of William, was drowned in a swimming pool, committed suicide, broke her own neck, beat herself up, got naked, got in the pool, and drowned. And then Bill comes home and calls 911. He does not take her body out of the pool. The 911 operator says, now you have your wife out of the pool. No, she's still in the water, in the deep end. Get her out of the pool. Oh, okay. And don't hang up the phone. Click. So why did they screw up George Harrison's place of death when they put it where supposedly he didn't die?
They will change up the information just to convolute it. This happens all the time.
Yeah.
Like we talk about George Harrison. And when people say about the numbers, because some people are like, I just don't believe the numbers. First of all, let me just explain it. I've said this to my audience so many times. It doesn't matter what you believe because you don't run anything.
It matters what the people in the club believe.
Right. It's their way of communicating. Think of it as kind of like a secret language or code that they use. Think of it in those terms. So George Harrison, I don't know if a lot of people know this. Probably a lot of Beatles fans do, though. There was an attempt on his life back in 1999.
Some person wandered onto a property.
Onto his property, right.
Right, with a knife, I think.
Yes, with a knife. So it was 1999. So when they look at their numbers, when they look at the year, they select either the last 2 digits or the first 3 digits, or they will add all of the digits together. There's many different iterations of how they come about their numbers. They're very creative, very clever, and very witty with how they come up with their numbers. But 1999 is 666 when we invert the nines. He was attacked at 3:30 in the morning, 33, and the guy that attacked him was 33 years old. And George was 56 years old. 5 plus 6 equals 11. So the thing is,
there's a lot of numerology in that story.
Yes, there's a lot there. Also, John Lennon was killed on December 8th of 1980. So December 8th, December is 12. 1 plus 2 is 3, plus 8 is 11. And then you have 1980 reduces to 9. So John Lennon's death was a 9/11 encoded event. People question the numbers. Instead of questioning it, take a step back, try to understand it, and then look for the patterns because the patterns are there.
So you're saying that John Lennon was killed at a 9/11 event.
It was 9/11 encoded.
I was playing dominoes in the Knights of Malta in the basement, which they called the Sewer Club, at a Masonic address of a triple nickel. I was in the basement below Montgomery Street and below California Street when John Lennon was being murdered at the Dakota, which the address is, it's a 9/11 address.
It's where they filmed Rosemary's Baby.
Rosemary's Baby.
Yes.
That has nothing to do with Satan or anything.
No. No, just blow past that.
But nothing to see here. Just keep moving. Um, I mean, that's pretty much in your face. If you think the devil has sex with a 21-year-old Mia Farrow, who's married to a much older Frank Sinatra, and they produced the devil's child at the Dakota, where Yoko Ono and Lauren Bacall and John Lennon gets killed. No, there's nothing unusual about that.
Well, also, if you take the poster for the movie of Rosemary's
Yes.
Baby, we have Mia Farrow
Yeah.
lying horizontal, and then you take the cover of the Imagine album and you turn it. It has John Lennon's profile. It's the exact same image.
Anyway, people, you should Google the Dakota and look at the address of where John Lennon was killed. It's a Masonic number.
Let me just go through this real quick because
Go
I'm
ahead.
sure people are probably still like, I don't know about these numbers. My head is spinning. The number 7 is very important in the occult, and the number 7 is very prominent within Aleister Crowley's teachings. And the number 7 is all around the Beatles. The number 7 in the occult represents perfection and spiritual enlightenment. So that's how they look at the number. So 6 represents our incarnation, our physical incarnation here in the material world. And 7 is spiritual, expanded consciousness, spiritual enlightenment. Now, the Beatles, the plan was to bring this enlightenment to the world, to move away from the traditional values, the institutionalized religions, right? Get away from that and move to enlightenment, spiritual enlightenment, expanded consciousness.
Tune in, turn on, drop out.
Right. That's right. That goes along with it. Obviously, that was a big mantra during the Summer of Love. Timothy Leary
worked with Yoko Ono and John Lennon in their bed-in.
The Beatles were reduced to 7. The biological pole period between 1962 and 1966 resulted in 7 UK albums. UK albums were their official releases, not capital. Forget about the capital releases.
Forget United States. Just
it was the UK.
England.
So that's Please Please Me through Revolver. 7 albums during his stint. On those 7 albums, there were 77 original, quote, Lennon and McCartney compositions. On each one of those records, from Please Please Me through Revolver, excluding A Hard Day's Night, there were 14 tracks on each album, 7 songs per side. Now, the number 14, when people see it, they try to understand what does it mean. 14 is another representation of 77 because 7 plus 7 equals 14. The number 5 is also a representation of 77 because you can sum to 5, 1 plus 4. 1 and 4 is 14. How do you get 14? 2 sevens. You see, when I talked about how clever they were with how they put together their numbers, see, some people just expect to see the number 7 or the number 6.
Right, right.
No.
When I told you the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas is at 3900 Las Vegas Boulevard, but if you add the numbers in that sequence, it's 12.
Right.
And that's 6s or 3333.
Right. So the first 7 albums, Please Please Me Through Revolver, is just loaded up with 7s. So from the perspective of the occultists who are behind all of this,
yes,
7, 7, 7. We're going to enlighten you. We're going to take you out of this realm of traditional thinking and, where you're oppressed and all of this stuff. And we're going to bring you to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Now, after Paul dies in September of 1966, the Beatles released a greatest hits album. It's called A Collection of Oldies. So that covered Beatles songs that were on albums between 1963 and 66. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, how is a song that's 3 years old classified or categorized as an oldie? What they did with the collection of oldies when they released it in December, I think it was December of 66, they were closing out the biological pole period. So
and we're making an alchemy to a new Beatle.
It's a transition. So some people would say, okay, well, how many tracks were on a collection of oldies? Well, there were 8 songs per side. They're like, well, that's not 14. No, it's 16, and 6 plus 1 equals 7. So then they get to Sgt. Pepper. And Sgt. Pepper is Billy's baby. It's him and George Martin. Okay. The rest of the Beatles, George Harrison basically wasn't there. In an interview that Billy did with Bernie Goldberg back, I think it was in the 1980s, Billy said, as Paul McCartney, when I say Billy, folks, I'm referring to Paul McCartney. He said that George Harrison was a no-show for most of the Sergeant Pepper sessions. He said that he was at home putting in a pool or something. That's almost an exact quote. So that calls into question, okay, so look, everybody thinks...
who's playing the guitar?
Exactly. Who's playing guitar if the guitarist is putting a pool in? And he wasn't there.
Well, you would know. You're a guitarist.
Well, it was, in all likelihood...
Somebody else, I guess.
It was Billy. It was probably Billy on most of those tracks, to be honest with you.
Right.
He's a guitar player also. But in any case, going to Pepper, right? So to continue with the Sevens, it was released in the UK. Remember now, folks, the UK versions of the albums are their official releases, not Capitol, right? It was released on June 1st, 1967. So June is 6 plus the day is 1. It's 7. 1967, in numerology, you can treat nines as zeros because anything times 9 reduces to itself the same way that anything times 0 equals 0. So you have 1967 would be 1067. 1 plus 6 is 7. Plus another 7 is 14. And what is 14? A representation of 77. So Sergeant Pepper was all about the sevens as well. It's Crowleyism. It's Thelema. In fact, I put a video up the other day on my channel. Another channel actually did this work. Brilliant piece of work. This solar eclipse today is a celebration of when Crowley first created his religion of Thelema back on April 8th of 1904. So it's 120 years later.
Yes.
And they're celebrating through this solar eclipse. Okay. So now the thing with Pepper, it is a funeral scene. The Sgt. Pepper cover is extremely complex, entirely Masonic, and it's all about geometry. And in the book, he has an entire chapter where he talks about the geometry of where people are looking, the angles. It's incredible. Unbelievable symbolism in it. I've told my audience for a long time, and I'm so glad that this person came out with this video, and I'll put the link down below for everybody to take a look at it. The spiritual belief system, the philosophy within that pyramid of power I talked about is Thelema. It's Crowley's Book of the Law.
And it's a universal centralized belief system.
The dominant belief system, spiritual belief system and philosophy is based in Crowley's religion of Thelema and the Book of the Law, which goes back to the Egyptian mysteries as well as Babylon. And this is why we have all of the Egyptian symbolism all around us. It's been all around us forever. It's everywhere. People wonder why it is. Why do we have obelisks and so on? It's all based in the Egyptian mysteries and where they're going. It's back to paganism. And just so the audience is clear, because a lot of folks think I bring this up because I'm Christian. I'm not Christian. I was born and raised as a Catholic, but I left the Catholic Church when I was 17 years old. I don't like labels, but people will sometimes ask me, well, if you had to put a label on it, what would you be? I'm a deist. But really, I don't even really stick with that because, my connection is with Source, the Creator, directly. So when I talk about Christianity and the war on Christianity within the scope of the Beatle work and what the controllers are doing, because there is a war on Christianity, I'm doing it from the perspective of the research and reporting on it as objectively as I possibly can. It's just a statement of fact. Also, some of the Thelemites, those that I think Crowley was a great guy, I will say that Crowley was a brilliant guy. He was quirky. He was an occultist. And from what I could tell in my research, he was very adept at being an occultist. Crowley believed that you couldn't progress through the degrees in the various secret societies, even within the OTO. He introduced sex magic, gay sex magic, homosexual gay sex magic into the OTO when a lot of the membership at the time were like, I don't think so. But when he took control of the OTO, he made it mandatory in order to achieve the higher levels, the higher degrees, those degrees.
I see.
And Crowley believed that you had to experience the darkness in order to ascend, in order to become enlightened. Okay. Now I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm just saying
they're playing God, aren't they? They're the masters of the universe.
Of course.
If they're designing our society,
of course,
then they're taking the role of a God.
Right. Well, this goes back to Crowley's book 77. So in his book 77, it's a one pager. You can read it. It says, there is no God other than man, and every man and woman is a star. So what do we hear coming out of the World Economic Forum from Yuval Harari? We've heard him say a number of times, we are becoming gods. So for people who are not familiar with the teachings of Crowley, they can't put any context around it. They don't understand what he's saying. What he's saying is we, as followers of Crowley, as Thelemites, followers of the Book of the Law, we are becoming gods. And this is what Crowley talked about. And people will want to argue with me sometimes and say, no, but Crowley was saying that we were leaving an age of oppression, which was the age of Pisces, or the age of Osiris. Osiris, his reign came to an end when his brother Set battled him and Set won. Now that's where we get the word sunset from. So the Piscean age was viewed by Crowley as being an age of oppression. It was rules laden. You didn't have free will. And the new eon, which was expressed to him by this being, Aiwass, during a channeling back in the early 1900s in Egypt, the age of Horus would bring about the light. Horus would come back to battle Set and free humanity, and humans would be able to pursue their pure and true will. So I'm giving everybody the very high level, simplistic overview of this thing. I mean, it can be very, very involved. But what Crowley says in his book 77, it's a whole litany of what you should be doing because of your will, to pursue your will. You can do this, you can do that. And anybody who gets in your way, you can kill them. He has like 5 bullets. On the 5th bullet, after he says, you must follow your pure will. I'm paraphrasing here. I don't have it in front of me right now. A sub-bullet says, and the rest will be our slaves. So when the Thelemites, or the people who are into Crowley, question me on this, and again, I'm just reporting my research, and I'm just trying to be as neutral as I possibly can on this thing. I'm trying to be objective. But when they come to me and say that his words are for all of humanity, I'm like, well, then who are the slaves?
Right. Humanity is going to be the slaves.
So what they don't really comprehend, or they don't know about, is that Crowley was part of the elite system. He was an elitist. He was part of British intelligence during World War I. Based upon what I read, that influence made its way also into World War II, although he died in 1947 at the age of 72. Crowley was part of that elite establishment, and that's what people have to understand. So when he was doing his work, he wasn't doing his work for the average Joe or Jane in the street. He was doing high-level ritual, magic, and all of that. So he's a very important player.
He is, and if people don't believe that, they could look at his itinerary. Didn't he travel extensively to all of the military places, including Cairo and Egypt and the pyramids? I think the guy got around.
He was always traveling. He was always traveling.
Yes. See, like Jack London or Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, or whatever their pseudonym or their real name. Mark Twain, Jack London, Aleister Crowley. To me, they look like military operatives because they seem to be able to get a hotel room anywhere in the world and are transported these places that sometimes commercial flights don't go. So it looks like they are military transported wherever, and then they write books and they have messages about their sage wisdom, their wisdom that they've garnered by visiting the pyramids in Egypt.
There's a fantastic book out called Agent 666. I think the author, and I hope I get his name right because it's a really good book, Richard Spence. And read that book. Read Agent 666. It gives you the entire lowdown, what he was involved in from a British intelligence perspective during World War I. And remember what we said earlier in this show about Tavistock's role going back to Wellington House in World War I. And if Crowley is heavily involved in World War I intelligence and propaganda, who do we think that he was connected into? He had to be connected into Wellington House, which later became Tavistock. It's very complex, Juxt. We could talk about this for hours.
I have an auditing background, Mike, and you've hit the ball out of the park. Okay, you hit the ball out of the park from an auditing point of view. What people don't seem to realize, like doubters, the naysayers that say that I'm a nutcase and I live in the basement of my mother's house, but they say I'm crazy because, see, they just don't want to open their brain to the fact of deductive reasoning, which is come to your own conclusions. when people ask me to prove to them something, I go, well, why don't you go do your research? They go, well, if you don't show me the proof, I'm not going to believe you. Well, I don't care. It's not my responsibility. You're going to give me a check, give me $100,000, and then I'll go ahead and put a kit together for you. But I'm not here to feed you. You got to go do it yourself because you're not going to believe anything I say anyway. You're not going to believe it. So go do it yourself.
That's what I tell them.
And they don't want to do it because they want to stay where they are in their belief system. When we do a financial audit, you usually look at, half of 1% of all the transactions that go on in a corporation or a business. You only look at a tiny sample size. You look at their controls and you look at the personnel that are in charge of signing checks and transferring money. You look at that, but no one's going to pay you $100 million to audit a company with $100 million of sales. They're going to say, look, I'll pay $25,000 to double check $100 million, but I'm not going to pay you more than that. So you have to look at a tiny sample size. So you look at the important transactions.
Right.
You use what's called your judgment. And you don't have to audit 100% of the Beatles to understand the Beatles. The Beatles as a social importance pop group, the Beatles in terms of Masonic messages. You could just look at the album covers. Isn't there an album cover where each of the Beatles has a bird cage over their heads?
That's actually images that are on the internet. Now, birdcage symbolism, it's Illuminati symbolism for mind control slave. There's also an image of John Lennon in a Superman shirt with his head next to a birdcage, and that the reference,
what
of
does
course.
That mean?
Well, the Superman shirt refers to the Ubermensch, the superhuman, which is really where the controllers are going, trying to create a world for themselves. And they consider themselves, look, John Coleman, in his book, The Committee of 300, I highly recommend this book too, okay?
Committee of 300, all right.
Committee of 300 refers to themselves as the Olympians, the gods. So when John Lennon has his head next to that birdcage and he's wearing a Superman shirt, this goes back to like 1965 or so, it's the Ubermensch, it's the superhuman, it's the Superman. Nietzsche wrote about this. You really have to get your head wrapped around that the world is not constructed the way you have been told it's been constructed. It does not work the way you've been told it works. You have been given a comic book presentation, a fictional tale about what your life and what your world is all about. And until you start to understand that it's not how you've been told, nothing's going to get fixed. Nothing.
Well, you just put your finger on another button, a hot button for me, is that, we're in a life and death war. A war meaning some kind of a reset, alchemy from the way that you and I, perceived the world. So part of the war is that we came to our own awakening realization that we were lied to. As Aaron Valente said, it was all a game. It was a thought experiment. And we thought that the Beatles were real. And we thought that everybody in Hollywood writes their own lines and they compose their melodies and then they put sweet lyrics to it. That they do that in Laurel Canyon on some cul-de-sac, and they drink and they smoke weed and they come up with all these hundreds of songs. Then they go down the hill and they record it in Gold Star Theater or Gold Star Studio on Santa Monica Boulevard. That's what we thought. And it turns out no. And then there's all this nanotechnology and radio frequency and optogenics and pollution in the air, and we're breathing it, and we're getting a jab, and we're getting a booster and getting a flu shot. And we're all being augmented and hooked up to this radio frequency because if you didn't know, aluminum, titanium, lithium, strontium is added to, what do you think a semiconductor silicon chip is? A silicon chip goes into an oven and can be molded into a shape, and it is radio frequency conductive silicon, which is a carbon isotope. It's a carbon isotope. But what people don't seem to understand is Silicon Valley is based not just on silicon chips, but adding aluminum, titanium, lithium, strontium, barium, arsenic poisoning, and adding it to the silicon because it creates superconductivity. And you have a silicon chip, which is radio frequency conductive, but times 100. You enhance, you augment. the silicon. You make it more powerful. Well, what if you did that by putting it into human beings and dogs? Well, you could be picked up by the radio frequency of RCA, Marconi, and EMI, and the music, and CBS, and you get an Ed Sullivan show in your brain. You go to sleep at night and be dreaming about Ed Sullivan and the Beatles appearance because maybe it got programmed into you. Maybe you're mind control programmed by the HAL 9000 supercomputer. You put your finger on something just now where you said about comedy, because I think it's a life or death situation, which is very grim. But the way that our controllers present everything to us is Larry David, Jerry Seinfeld, Woody Allen. Oh, bring out Sam Kinison, who is my favorite comedian by far. And I've seen a lot of comedians. Johnny Carson. These people that on the radio and on television are presenters, they all have comedian backgrounds and dramatic art skills. And they follow their script because they're military intelligence operatives. The comedians, because they soften the message, or they make jokes about people like me, or they make jokes about people like you. Who would dare challenge that Paul McCartney didn't write all of his music? I mean, of course he did. What's wrong with you?
Right.
And they make you into a clown. But it's the clown on the stage is a military operative, making people laugh whilst they're raining down metamaterials, which in Hebrew, meta means dead. It means your brain doesn't function anymore. You're hooked up to the HAL 9000. The only thoughts you have or whatever is the algorithm, the Aleister Crowley program is what you are.
Yeah.
Because you're a slave.
Yeah. Well, the people need to understand, again, it's like a broken record. They need to understand that their thoughts are not their own. People are programmed.
You have experience in hypnosis?
Yes. I was a master hypnotherapist. I was board certified by the International Association of Counselors and Therapists, and I was in private practice for 12 years. I helped hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people.
So you understand what this is about.
Yeah. I did a presentation in South Carolina going back about 2 years ago, and I took everybody through how this all works, how they are programming you through the television set. And maybe I'll put a link down to that presentation as well for this show. For the folks that think that you're crazy and I'm crazy and a bunch of other people that are out there doing great work to try to get the truth out there that they're crazy as well, you have no idea how silly you look, how silly it is at the things that you say, and how far off the mark you are as to how this all works. You can make fun of Juxt, you can make fun of me all you want, but I'm going to tell you right now, it has no effect on me. It has no effect on my work. In a way, we almost get to the point where we have the same or a very similar view of humanity after a while as the controllers do.
Start to think that they're profane.
Yes, you start to look at them and you say they're profane. They don't understand. And not only do they not understand, because at one point I didn't understand either.
Right.
But I took the initiative and I was intrepid enough to say, hey, I've got to go learn these things. I got to teach myself. The problem we have, Juxt, is these people don't want to get off their asses and do anything. They don't want to read a book. They don't want to do research. Like you said before, it made me laugh because I get this sometimes. You need to show me. I don't need to show you anything.
No.
I'm not here for you. Okay. I'm here for me. I like doing this research. I like putting it out. I like discussing it. That's what I like to do.
The thing is that I actually feel like I'm involved in a psyops that's creating anxiety for me, because when I had to put my dog down, which I sort of think might have been murdered by the things in my neighborhood, right? Because my dog was sneezing a lot during the last year of his life.
Yeah.
And he lived by it and died by his nose. And beautiful dog. And I had great times with him. But if I find out, that he was murdered, then, that's unforgivable to me. It's just completely unforgivable that your children or your grandchildren would be threatened. I just don't think that's funny. And I don't think anyone should make a joke about that. Nope. There's no levity. There's no frivolity. That's very serious. And when I look around my neighborhood and I have neighbors that drive their car alone by themselves wearing a face diaper, that is very disturbing to me. So I didn't comply with any of the rules. I didn't social distance. I didn't wear a face diaper because I didn't want to be a cult ritual slave. But most of the people in my neighborhood did. And they looked at me with that I'm a disobedient person and that I'm endangering the neighborhood. But the gist of it is 3 years out, not a single person died in my neighborhood. Hey, I went out to walk my dog and run my dog in the vineyards and in the park, and I didn't find one corpse, no dead bodies anywhere. Then I went to 6 acute care hospitals. From Orange County all the way up to Santa Rosa, to Marin County, to Sutter Hospital in Roseville. I went to 6 different hospitals, including San Francisco. And I went to the garage, the parking garage, and it was empty. And then I went to the front of that, and they said, yes, sir, you have to put a mask on. And who are you here to see? And you can only visit your family. It was exactly like the county jail, that there's visiting hours and the restrictions, and if you're not a blood relative, and the hospitals were empty, and there were no nurses there. And so then I go turn the TV on, and they're telling me they got to put cup tents up, and they got to create these. That's a total lie.
Yep.
I mean, but everybody in my neighborhood believed that the hospitals had a pandemic, and there was 33 new COVID cases today, an echo chamber, and it was a bald-faced lie. But no matter who I spoke to, they said, no, you're crazy. So I was the crazy one, but I'm the only person. I said, have you been to the UC San Francisco? No. Okay, give me the name of a person that died from COVID. Well, I know people. I said, okay, name one. Well, it's a friend of a friend. I go, doesn't count. It has to be someone you personally know. It's a pandemic, so you must know a dozen people.
Somebody must have died. Yeah.
Somebody. And nobody, not a single person could name a dead COVID person. But my brother and I, we can name 13 people that got vaccinated that are dead, that were under 62 years old, all the way down to age 34.
My wife and I did the same thing. When it came out, we went to the hospitals. So we went to 3 hospitals, 2 very large ones here in North Carolina, in the Raleigh area, and another one, a smaller one. They had the tents, and guess what? Tumbleweed blowing through the parking lot. Nobody there. In fact, we went to one of the hospitals. I believe it was Rex. They had the tents up, and there were 3 people by a podium at the front of the hospital leading into the tents, playing with their phones, and it was desolate. Even the parking lots weren't that full for people that, would have been going to the hospital for stuff like broken arm, whatever, heart conditions or whatever.
Because everyone's sheltering in place so they're not out getting hurt.
Look, excuse the language. It was just total bullshit. And people bought into this, and I even did a video on it. My wife and I said we took a drive around to the 3 hospitals, and I was showing people. And then we had a center, it was a local town center here, and had given out the shots, right, for free. So I didn't know this at the time, so I was going for a walk, and I'm seeing this line of cars right down the main road through town. It is backed up like you wouldn't believe. And I'm thinking, what is going on here?
Right.
And then I see the sign. All of these nitwits were in the car going to go get their shot. When I figured this out, because the way I figured it out was I finally came across a sign that said, free shots here and a big arrow. I took out my phone. I was filming the line of cars because I said, nobody's going to believe this. So as I'm doing this, Juxt, people see me with the camera, and this is what they're doing behind the wheels. They're covering their faces. So I'm thinking to myself,
so they're being obedient, but they don't want to be seen as being patriotic, because they always sell this as you're being good to your fellow person by getting vaccinated.
Very interesting, right? Why are you embarrassed?
That's a psychological question. Doesn't it seem like that's a juxtaposition?
Yeah. Why are you embarrassed?
You should be proud.
Proud to be in this line. I'm the one that should be doing this, covering my face, right?
Right, because you're non-compliant.
I'm a non-compliant outlier. But this is the thing, right? This is what we're up against. And
well, I don't think that's a battle we can win, because you can't, stupid is as stupid does. And you just got to get out of the way. My mother said that was called tough love, that when you have friends that you have shared experience with, you played music with, you rode motorcycles with, whatever, and it turns out that you look up and it's a dangerous situation and you tell them and they ignore you, you got to walk away.
Yeah.
You don't want to spend time with someone who's determined to be living in an unhealthy way. I don't understand the psychosis where a person can just be obedient, wear the face diaper.
And the whole COVID thing, Juxt, the force behind all of that?
Tavistock.
All right, folks.
Hello.
There are people in the conspiracy research, truth community, alternative research arena that still don't understand the magnitude
Yeah.
of this institute. They just don't get it. They don't understand how important it is. They don't understand how deep their reach is, how wide it is. It's like a gigantic octopus. They have their tentacles into everything. They have it in your media. They have it in your schools. They have it in your military. They have it in your government. They have it in your politics. It's everywhere.
Remember, John Kennedy was the only fake president to actually give that speech that you just did, April 27th, 1961, I believe. Just before the Beatles signed their contract, John Kennedy went to the heart of the beast. He went to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Manhattan, New York, and in front of the Mockingbird, lie to your face, fake media, the newspaper people, the press people, he read that speech about full spectrum dominance, about intimidation, not free choice. It's guerrillas by night, not armies by day. And it's all about infiltration, not invasion. And that's what you just said. That's exactly what you just said. But you've read books on the Tavistock Institute. You have a military mind. I have a relative that was close to me that was indoctrinated in the United States Marines, went to Somalia and Haiti and other parts in the Mediterranean, and he was brainwashed in the Marines. And he's an officer. He was an officer in the Marines. But there's tremendous mind control exercises that you're put under, because many of the orders that you will get are to kill people, to kill innocent people. And you have to follow orders. We follow orders or people die. They want robots. And you know what? Apparently that's what we're going to do now. We're going to robots who will not disobey. We don't want anyone disobeying the orders. So you know what? Just get rid of the people and we'll go to the artificial intelligence soldiers, and we'll have invisible weapons. You don't have to be a member of a political organization or a truther movement to speak truth. You use deductive reasoning, you use personal experience, you use testing your hypothesis, going to a hospital and seeing if there's dead bodies on the sidewalk, seeing if there's cars in the parking lot. I mean, anyone can do that. And only the lazy-minded people will just watch television. I mean, you realize that television is lying to you 24/7 through commercials or music or fake TV shows, or God forbid, fake documentaries from fake screenwriter, director, producer types who are all getting paid money to lie. If you believe their lies, you are as profane as you can possibly be, giving the controllers enormous confidence that, yes, they're sheeple, they're cattle, and we should practice human husbandry, which is what you do with cows and chickens. You beef them up, you feed them corn, then you slaughter them. When you decide, when the farmer decides, and that's how they're treating the profane.
Yeah, and I know to some of the audience what we're saying and the way we're expressing it might sound harsh to them, but look, folks, we're at a point now where it's very critical.
Yeah, time is running out. Is there some other aspect of the presentation, Mike, that you want to make before we sign off?
The only thing I will say is that the brunt of my work with the Beatles deals with whether they wrote all their own music or not, and whether they played on all of their recorded tracks. And I will leave the links down below because we don't have the time to go through all this.
What's your conclusion? What is your conclusion? Did the Beatles write all their music and perform all the recorded tracks in the studio?
No. We break it up into two periods, between 1962 and 1966, which was the biological Paul period. This is before Billy showed up. And I concluded that they wrote very little, if anything. Actually, where I'm landed today is the number is 0. And so between 62 and 66, they did not write all their own music, and they did not play on all of their recorded tracks. The recorded tracks are performed by studio musicians, and the Silver Bullet, the proof in the pudding, is their 6th album, Rubber Soul.
Rubber Soul.
Yes. And I do.
Because you're saying the logistics, the timing, the amount of energy to put out the number of songs in a short period of time, when they already had very busy promotional schedule, is logistically impossible.
There's 2 issues with Rubber Soul. The one is the writing, the learning, the rehearsing, the arrangement and the recording, the mixing of the album. 16 brand new songs, from scratch in 30 days. 14 for the album and 2 for a double A-side single. And
It's
the
a very
song,
narrow window.
yeah, it's not possible. And I go through in very intricate detail why I came to that conclusion. And if somebody thinks objectively and they're intellectually honest, they will look at the presentation, and especially if they're musicians and songwriters who have recording experience, they should easily conclude that, okay, well, that didn't happen. And the second piece of it is, a couple of folks said to me, is even more damaging, because people will always try to, massage the 16 songs in 30 days, but they were geniuses, Mike. Geniuses can do anything. They weren't geniuses, folks. Okay. They were just 4 lads, 4 guys.
Yeah,
and,
I'm nothing personal. It's nothing personal.
It's not personal.
Integrity as a person,
right.
Man.
I don't pick on the Beatles. They were 4 guys. They were young men that got into this deal, and, they were playing their part. But the other piece of it is, Juxt, is the whole manufacturing process. Being able to get the album covers printed, the labels printed. Their job was to learn the pre-recorded, pre-written songs in 30 days, sing them so they could do the vocals. They were on the hook for the vocals, just like the Monkees were on the hook for the vocals. And once that wrapped up, then George Martin married the vocal tracks with the pre-recorded instrumental tracks. He mixed them down. Now the song is complete. Now we can press a record. But the one problem with the timeline on the manufacturing process is George Martin did not complete the sequencing of the songs until November 16th of 1965. So they finished up recording on November 11th into the early hours of November 12th. On November 16th, George Martin does the sequencing. Now, sequencing is the order in which the songs are going to appear on the album. Track 1 is this, track 2 is that, side A, side B. The sequencing of the songs, right? So you have to have the titles of the songs will be in that order on the 33 RPM center label. And
on the cover backside.
On the cover. Exactly. Now, if you didn't finish up the sequencing until November 16th.
Because the printing process would start after the sequencing.
Right. Because you can't submit you can't submit the requirements for the printing until you know the names of the songs and the order in which they're going to play. Okay.
When did the album covers get finished?
Well, this is the thing. The official story tells us that George Martin completed the sequencing on the 16th, and they cut the final mono lacquer on the next day, November 17th, the next day, which means they created the stampers, and they either started pressing the albums on the 17th or the latest, November 18th. Now,
because that all takes time.
Of course. We're talking about thousands and thousands of labels, thousands of album covers that had to be in-house, ready to be pressed between the 16th and the 17th of November. And by the way, when you send stuff off to printing, it has to be proofed. You just don't print it and just shove it out the door. Everything's got to be proofed. That whole process creates a gigantic problem for the official narrative. And the other thing, too, is when you press a vinyl record, the label is pressed at the very same time that the record is pressed. It's an automated process. So the label gets pressed with the vinyl at the exact same time. It's part of the pressing process. You don't put the labels on afterward. The labels go on when the record is pressed. So that means, everybody, that the labels for Rubber Soul and the album jackets had to be thousands and thousands, had to be in-house no later than November 17th when they cut the final mono lacquer. They had to get the record out into retail by December 3rd for the Christmas season. EMI Parlophone had to capitalize on a new Beatle album because it brought in tons of money. Joseph Lockwood, who was the CEO for EMI Parlophone, said that the Beatles were a huge piece of their profit. So there's no way they were going to miss a Christmas record from the Beatles, in 1965.
So realistically, they would have had to do a lot of work in October or September to be really ready to have this thing go out by December 3rd, right?
Well, the inking process to create the album covers is a 4-ink process. So they have the old ink rollers, right? And so I was working with somebody who was very, very well versed in the vinyl pressing process and also very accomplished in the music industry. I can't say who this person is. And he said to me, Mike, it takes 1 week for the ink to dry alone. When did the process start? So this person, when I worked with him, said to me It was typically a 2-month process, 8 weeks for everything, which included the pressing of the vinyl, the creation of the album jackets,
Right.
the printing of the labels, the distribution process, staging and distribution, I should say, getting the albums out to the retail outlets. Because back then, there was no box stores. Everything was small retail outlets, record stores that you had to get the shipments out to. So I said, okay, well, let's just say that EMI said, okay, well, we have to pull out all of the stops. Okay, this is the Beatles. How quickly could they do it? What's an expedited process? So he said, let me look at this and I'll get back to you in a couple of days. So he got back to me, says, all right, look, 6 weeks. That's it. Anything
That would be like super fast.
super fast. Like in other words, they pulled out all the stops.
Yeah,
and so
probably longer than
it is. I said it's 8 weeks. It could go out to 10 weeks. But in any case, so the point being is, in order to have all of the printed material, the labels, jackets, and all that stuff in-house, ready to be pressed by November 17th, meant that the process had to start in early October. Well, the Beatles came to the studio on October 11th. That's when they arrived. So that process was well underway by the time the Beatles showed up, which means the names of the songs were already known. The run times of the songs were already known, because when you do the sequencing for an album, the run times are important because you have to balance both sides of the vinyl.
the music's already been created and performed by studio musicians.
Right.
But we need the voice of the Beatles.
Right. So what happened was the Beatles came into EMI on October 11th, and George Martin sat him down and he said, okay, so I'm going to play the music for you. Undoubtedly, the music had a guide vocal on it so that they can learn it. So that's what they were doing for 30 days. So here's the song. Here's the first song they recorded, Run for Your Life. So John Lennon, this is going to be credited to you, John. So here's the song. Here's the guide vocal. So, John's running through it. And then he's ready to do the vocal, and he does it. So now that vocal's in the bag. Run for Your Life is done. The other thing too is the Rubber Soul story tells us that the Beatles, they had to write from scratch. They had to learn the songs. In other words, so if John and Paul were actually writing songs, they would come out of the room and say, hey, George and Ringo, come over here. Let me show you the song. We're going to teach you how it goes. And once I show it to you, then we're going to rehearse it. And then once we rehearse it, there's going to be changes to the songs because you guys are going to say, why don't we do a little bit of this or a little bit of that? So the arrangement of the song is going to change. And then if the arrangement changes, then you have to rehearse it again. And then then you're ready to go record, right? The story tells us that it took no more than 5 takes to lay down the basic rhythm tracks for any of the songs. No more than 5 takes. It's a ridiculous premise. It's absolutely absurd. And what I told my audience is if we go to the White Album, which is 3 years later, many of the White Album songs, the number of takes, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 takes, I think, for the song Not Guilty, a George Harrison song that didn't make it on the White Album. He released it later in his solo career.
And supposedly he had a lot of experience by then.
Well, the point being is, what happened to all of the recording prowess 3 years later? You were able to do the basic
it all fell
tracks
apart. It's like you forgot how to do recordings.
in 5 or less takes for Rubber Soul, but when you got to the White Album, it's taking you dozens and dozens and dozens of takes to get the rhythm tracks, the basic rhythm tracks down.
He got worse. He's like incompetent.
Yeah, right, exactly. It went backwards. So from 67 to 1970, that's the second phase, where Billy was, in the band as Paul McCartney. The book tells us what Billy did, and I believe this to be true because we can hear it on the White Album. He was moving them along. He was trying to develop them to writing songs and playing on the recorded tracks. So starting with the White Album, not so much with Sgt. Pepper, because Pepper was Billy and George Martin. And that's not to say that George Harrison, although he's putting a pool in most of the time, John Lennon and Ringo didn't play on Sgt. Pepper. It was mostly the Billy and George Martin show. Once we get to the White Album, George and John in particular are writing more of their own material and playing more on the recorded tracks. But they were still using ghostwriters and they were still using session players on the songs.